And now we have David Close, who is well known to a number of councillors here as a former councillor, as a former chair of the Finance Committee, as I believe.
Yes, I seem to recall that. Thank you very much. I'll be very brief. I'll just emphasise the main points of my submission and leave a bit of time for questions. The first point that I really made was that there's not enough information in this document to fulfil its primary purpose, which was admirably stated by the Mayor and the Acting Chief Executive in introduction when they said, we need to decide what is important and what can wait. But this plan did not really provide the public with the information in the sort of form to which the public could respond and provide you with guidance on what the public see as the priorities. Secondly, and this is more serious, there's not enough hard financial information in this document for the council to make a decision on this annual plan. Because although it sets out briefly the problems you face, such as, well, the new problem since last year, the reduced rating base, the higher interest rates, the reduced insurance payout, and the higher costs, it does not quantify the effects of these increased costs on your long-term plan. Because if you're borrowing $2 billion for 30 years, you've got to know the impact not just on 2014-15, which is what this plan does, you've got to know the impact for the future. And you're deciding, as a result of this plan, to borrow another $500 million, or I think it's $575 million. And the interest rates are going up by 1%, so that's another $5.75 million that you've got to provide for interest just on that new borrowing. But there is nothing here which gives councillors and the public the long-term impact of the financial decisions which are in this plan. There's no spreadsheet for 10 years showing total operating expenditure, total capital expenditure for each year, rates required, etc., cumulative debt. And this was standard in all council annual plans until a few years ago. So I noticed that the council was a little self-congratulatory, Madam Mayor, in saying that it had kept the rate increase for this year to 6%. My question is, what impact does that have on next year? Because in my experience, whenever we trim the rate increase for year one, we often pushed it out for year two. So maybe, and I guess Rafe knows the answer to this question, it may be that in trimming it back to 6.6% this year, you've actually pushed it out maybe to 8 or 9 next year. I don't know. But that's the sort of information you need to have before you can decide whether or not to adopt this plan in its current state. Thirdly, I thought the plan lacked a strategy to deal with the very significant financial crisis which you face. The guts of what I think the council ought to try to do is on page 6 of my submission. Where I say that the council should recognise that controlling capital expenditure is the key to averting a debt crisis. Oh, thank you. So controlling that capital expenditure is the key to do it. And so the council should endeavour to prioritise capital expenditure along lines of urgent and necessary and desirable, etc. And point 3 here is, I guess, the most important point. Manage the capital program by a combination of deferrals, downsizing, staging, and, if necessary, deletion of projects. Now, this is not new stuff. This is the oldest trick in the book. And I think that in every financial plan of which I had any part, we always had to go through this process every annual plan. You defer some projects that can be deferred, you delete a few that aren't important, you downsize some, and you stage some. We can't afford to build the big new bridge in 1 year. We'll fund it and build it over 2. So it's the problem you face is huge, but it's not different in character from the problem which every council faces every year. In other words, you've got to manage down your costs in order to conform with what are the reasonable expectations of the community as far as rate increases go, and according to prudent financial management. So I guess I didn't see a strategy here for doing this, and really it needs to be done now, because if, as someone suggested to me, you're doing an annual plan, what is it called, a long-term plan?
The long-term plan,
That's
yeah.
a year away. You cannot really allow the council to hemorrhage for another year without actually doing something about it. I guess if I think back to our capital programs, we often had to reprogram about $50 million of expenditure, capital expenditure, when we're doing our annual plan. Your task probably is to reprogram about 500 million. And I do suggest there's a little appendix there, attachment. I suggest ways in which you can save money by spreading the capital expenditure out over a slightly longer period. And I was surprised to see that you can get significant savings even from doing, say, 1.6 billion of expenditure over 5.5 years instead of 4. Over a period of the 30 years of the loan, you actually save 150 million simply by doing something over 5.5 years instead of 4. If, in my second example, you decide to do things over 7 years instead of 4, you actually save about 450 million over the 30 years. It's big money. So I would urge the council to consider using deferral as the chief instrument. Even if you started to, I think I mentioned this in my paper, even if you started to repair the town hall tomorrow, it would take probably 6 years to finish it. So why not bite the bullet and say, okay, we'll put the town hall on hold for 5 years or whatever. And by doing that, you save this incredibly steep build-up in debt, and you cut down on your costs, especially for loan servicing. I noticed an earlier person say that he wants rate increases in the region of 1 to 3%, and that is lovely to have, and you might be able to have it under normal times, but we're not living in normal times, and you've inherited a situation from previous councils who borrowed instead of putting up the rates. Instead of cutting expenditure, they borrowed. And so the council was in a bit of a hole even before the earthquakes, and then the council pretended that you could have all this loss of wealth in Christchurch without it costing you anything. And so, there was borrowing to fund an operational deficit. So you're faced with a very difficult situation, but the sooner you bite the bullet, the better. Just one more thing, Madam Mayor, about housing. I referred in my submission to the fact that the objective in repair of housing is repair and rebuild of facilities undertaken as per the agreed facilities rebuild program. I thought that was a bit vague. But when I went to a housing committee meeting on one day recently, I think it might have been Tuesday, I was told that this facilities program for council housing runs out of money in August. So it's set out what will be done year by year over the next few years, but the problem is the program runs out of money in August. So the facilities rebuild program is not worth really the paper it's written on beyond August. However, I understand that when the council gave the government, or sold to the government, the red zone land, it included 113 red zone units. And I understand that the staff report at the time informed councillors that it would be necessary for there to be an internal transfer from the ordinary council funds into the Housing Development Fund in order to compensate the Housing Development Fund for that loss of the 113 units. That seems to me entirely reasonable. 113 units, 100,000 each, that's about 11.3 million.
We had a price on that the other day at one of the hearings. Yeah, it was more than that.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
that was just a back of an envelope, but
Yeah.
whatever would actually enable that program to continue. It won't help the council's overall financial situation, make it a wee bit worse, but I think it's unconscionable for it that transfer not to take place. Sorry, I've used my full 10 minutes. I was going to leave a lot of time for questions.
Well, I did want to ask a question, and that was around waste minimisation, because you've raised a concern that I wasn't aware of in with respect to the amount of increase. One of the proposals that came to the council before it got to this stage was to review the numbers of times that the bins were collected. There was a concern, well, I certainly felt that there would be a concern about going out and reducing services, but I like your idea of reviewing the efficiency of the current waste minimisation model, because it's increased by, you say, it's gone from 4% of rating income to now 10% of rating income. So it's gone from 6.2 million to 34.7 million. And I guess that wasn't apparent to me when we had our briefing on it, because that's an amount of money I'm concerned about and would want us to review as a council. Ali?
Quickly. David, when you talk about the festivals and
Yes.
events, you talk about success with them, and you suggest that look at reducing overall cost by 30% by deleting the least successful. Are you talking about attendance? Are you talking about money only? What are you basing successful on? Is it a financial?
I guess if I were in your situation, I'd put that over to the staff and say prioritise the 9 million, spend 6 million in 2014-15, prioritise.
You might get a good buzz off something and it might do the city well, but it might actually end up costing.
Well, look at their recommendations. I personally am not in a position. I always thought that the ice thing was a bit crazy, because sometimes we had really warm weather in the week when we went to having a snow festival. But look, really, I don't know. But what I do know is that is absorbing a disproportionate amount of money. If you can compare what you're spending on basic services like water, which I think about 15 million a year, is it? Maybe 20, 18, I can't remember. This is a huge sum. And it's rising as a proportion of council expenditures. Not as if it's just rising in accordance with, it's actually increased hugely. So I think a hard look at efficiency, I think provider capture has happened very much in this events industry. And there are other people around the table who know more about this than I do. I just think it's something you should have a really hard look at. As for the waste minimisation, it seems to me that most people would be quite happy to have a yellow bin collected once a month and a red bin collected once a month. I think the green one needs to be collected at least once a fortnight. But if people, in fact, need more than one yellow bin a month, it would be quite easy for them to pay $10 or $20, whatever it is, to have a second yellow bin or a second red bin. And there's nothing in the red bin or the yellow bin that couldn't wait for a few days. Most people, I think, would be happy. And that could make a very significant saving. And the council has got to work really, really hard at every operational expenditure area. And I just looked at a couple, but you people will be more familiar with some of these things and see where savings might be made.
I thank you very much for your submission. I just enjoyed reading it. Didn't enjoy reading it for the content, but you've really alerted us to our responsibility here to really scrutinise the numbers very, very carefully, and I really am pleased that you brought that to our attention. I will, because I'm chairing the meeting, I'm allowed to do this, but we've gone over time. I'd just make a comment about your suggestion that we renegotiate the binding agreement with the government on the grounds that circumstances have changed since the agreement was signed. That's an assumption that the people that signed the agreement didn't know what the circumstances were, and
yes,
they may not have changed from what was understood at the time.
When I read the Court of Mental report, it seemed to me that they were saying that the council, at the time of signing the agreement, disputed some of the Crown's figures to the
Correct.
tune of about maybe 300 or 400 million, and that they were under some pressure to decide within a very short space of time. And obviously, under normal circumstances, the council would have said, hey, let's defer this for a few days, let's ask our staff to give us more information. But instead, because of the pressure of the parliamentary timetable, the council was pressured into making a decision very quickly, under threat of losing money, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's the public perception, but what I'm saying, what I'm putting on the table is that there were people who signed the agreement who knew exactly what the situation could be for the council, and they signed it anyway.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yes, point taken. Yes.
thank you.